Hi, I'm Suzanne and this is my May reading wrap-up. I finished 4 novels in May. 2 of them were the last 2 books in Saara El-Arifi's adult fantasy trilogy. Let's start with The Battle Drum. Anor is the first blue-blooded ruler of the Warden's Empire, but before her reign has even started, she is falsely accused of a murder and she must solve the crime without the help of her lover Sylah. Sylah has left the Empire in search of a solution to the hurricane that threatens her land. The new truths she learns change everything she knows, and soon she must prepare for an oncoming battle. Meanwhile, Hassa, the ghosting spy, uncovers more atrocities of the Empire's past and present. The Battle Drum is the second book in Saara El-Arifi's fantasy trilogy, The Ending Fire. I read the first book, The Final Strife, last year and gave it 4 stars. The Battle Drum is a solid sequel to the first book, but unfortunately it suffers from a middle book syndrome. First, the good. I loved learning more about the world outside the Warden's Empire. The world felt real and immersive with unique details. Bonus points for the handy recap of the events of the first book in the beginning. It made this book a lot easier to follow as I had forgotten a lot of the details of the Final Strife. The Battle Drum also had a lot of twists and turns, which made it an entertaining read. There are 5 point of view characters, the 3 main female characters as well as Sylah's ex-lover Jon and a new female character Nayeli. Since each of the point of view characters had their own plotlines and different settings, the other plotlines were basically put on hold for several chapters to follow one character. It made the book seem a little choppy and disjointed. It didn't help that majority of her storyline Sylah was injured and unconscious. And instead of trying to execute changes to the government, Anor's storyline was taken over by a false murder accusation. I also didn't like how Anor jumped to clearly false conclusions about who the murderer was. We didn't see any character development from Sylah or Anor. A lot of their scenes ended up feeling like filler. However, I loved Hassa's storyline and was intrigued by Nayeli's character. I still didn't care much for Jon, but his character did grow on me a little bit. The second book in a trilogy is a tricky one. I often end up not liking it as much as the first or the third books. That was the case this time as well. Nevertheless, this book sets up the last book nicely. I'm giving this book 3.5 stars, but if you loved The Final Strife, it's definitely worth the read. And then the last book in the trilogy, The Ending Fire. The Warden's Empire, the Blood Forged, and the Salam are preparing for a coming war. In the Warden's Empire, a vigilante called Truthsayer raises an army against the Wardens, and Sylah and Hassa have to navigate the changing political system while searching for Anor. After joining her grandmother, Anor is celebrated as the Child of Fire who will bring victory to the Salam. She finds herself a new purpose as they set off on their last voyage to wage war against the other nations. This is the third and final book of the Ending Fire trilogy. There is again a helpful recap of the events of the previous book, as well as a glossary and a list of characters. Majority of this book was spent on the war preparations and the actual battle. The book is not as heavy in terms of world building as the first and the second books. And the things we learned about in the previous books finally come to fruition. The first half of the book is rather slow, but as the battle approaches, the pacing picks up. Maybe even a little too much, as the ending did feel a little rushed. In terms of the main characters, Hassa was easily my favorite. I wish we had seen more Sylah in this book, as I found her character intriguing in The Final Strife. She was pushed more to the sidelines in The Battle Drum and The Ending Fire. I still didn't care for Jon or his budding romance. And Anor actually took steps backwards with her naive trust in her grandmother and the Salam. I wish we had seen more character development on her part. Since there were so many point of view characters, the book doesn't quite manage to wrap up everyone's storyline in a satisfactory manner. For example, over the course of the book, Anor develops a drug addiction, but in the end she overcomes it easily. Since Sylah's addiction was handled so well, I was a little disappointed that in Anor's case the aftermath was brushed over so fast, but I can forgive it considering that having her face the same ordeal as Sylah would have most likely felt repetitive. I don't think Anor received a proper redemption arc though. I'm not sure how I feel about the ending or the epilogue. I don't want to give spoilers, but if you're interested to hear more about my thoughts about the ending, I talk about them in my blog post about this book. Despite that small stumble at the end of the book, I found this an exhilarating ending to the trilogy. While this series doesn't quite reach a 5-star status for me, I enjoyed this series a lot, and I'm giving this book 4 stars. If you enjoy fantasy novels about racism, religious zealotry, and overthrowing oppressive governments, I can definitely recommend this series. The third novel I finished is Hannah Gaines' Godkiller. This is also an adult fantasy. After a brutal war between gods and people, worship of gods is forbidden in the kingdom of Midron. Gissen makes a living as a god killer, but when she meets a god that has bonded with a young girl, she promises not to kill him. They set out to the ruined city of Plenraden to ask for help from the last wild gods haunting the place. On the way, they meet a former knight on a mission to save the king. Godkiller is the first book in Hannah Gaines' fantasy trilogy Fallen Gods. This was a fast-paced and exciting read. Although the plot was rather simple, there were nice twists along the way to keep my interest up. I also liked all 4 point of view characters. There wasn't a single one whose chapters I wanted to skip. Despite them all being moody and grumpy, it was easy to learn to like them and root for them. I also liked the disabled and queer representation in this book. The world building was intricate and fascinating, but I did find myself occasionally lost with all the different nations and place names. The map wasn't really helpful either, as it was more ornamental than useful. In general, I prefer it when fantasy series expand the world slowly. A more detailed map of just Midron would have worked better. At first, I was also unsure about the function of the prologue. It mentioned characters who didn't play any role in the later narrative. The prologue did play an important role by the end of the novel, but the information could have just as easily been given in a flashback. But all these things were rather minor grievances. A bigger grievance for me was the relationship between Gissen and the ex-knight Elagast. Their romance developed so slowly that I wasn't even sure if it was intended as a romance. That is, until they all of a sudden not only kiss, but also immediately have sex in a totally unnecessary, although fade to black, sex scene. However, all in all, I enjoyed this book and I'm excited to continue with the series. I'm giving this book 4.5 stars. I highly recommend it if you love fantasy with strong heroines and mischievous or cruel gods. I also reread The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. This is a YA dystopian fiction and so well known that I'm not going to review it. This is one of my favorite YA books and obviously worth 5 stars. I also finished a lot of non-fiction books. Many of them I've already taken back to the library. A notable non-fiction book I read in May is Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. I had been meaning to read it for years and I highly recommend it if you've ever felt that your job is meaningless. I also reread 3 writing guides. Creating Character Arcs by K.M. Wayland. Save the Cat writes a novel by Jessica Brody. And The Anatomy of Story by John Truby. I talk more about how I use these books to outline my current work in progress in my previous writing blog. My goal is to read 5 books in June, including these 3. I'm currently in the middle of The Cautious Traveler's Guide to the Wastelands by Sarah Brooks. This is a steampunk fantasy. I also want to read Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. This is a novel in verse. I also want to finally finish Susan Faluti's Backlash, The Undeclared War Against Women. And I want to read 2 novels from my mother's bookshelf when I go to visit her. Those were the books I read in May and my goals for June. Let me know in the comments what your favorite read in May was and I'll see you in my next video.